President Obama just announced he would not defend the defense of marriage law before the courts. He says it's unconstitutional, the act is. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, he campaigned in favor of it. Let's be clear, he is breaking his word to the American people. Second, he swore an oath on the Bible to become president, that he would uphold the Constitution and enforce the laws of the United States. He's not a one-person Supreme Court. The idea that we now have the rule of Obama instead of the rule of law should frighten everybody. Imagine that Governor Palin had become president. Imagine that she had announced that Roe versus Wade in her judgment was unconstitutional, and therefore the United States government would no longer protect anyone's right to have an abortion because she personally had decided it should be changed. The news media would have gone crazy. The New York Times would have demanded her impeachment. The fact that the left likes the policy as allowing them to ignore the fact that this is a very unconstitutional act. I believe the House Republicans next week should pass a resolution instructing the president to enforce the law and to obey his own constitutional oath, which he took on taking office.
What if he doesn't?
And should say, if he fails to do so, that they will zero out the office of Attorney General and take such other steps as are necessary until the president agrees to do his job. His job is to enforce the rule of law. And for us to start replacing the rule of law with the rule of Obama is a very dangerous precedent.
Is what he's doing impeachable in your view?
I think that's something you get to much later, but I think clearly it is a dereliction of duty, clearly it is a violation of his constitutional oath, and clearly it is something which cannot be allowed to stand.
Okay. At what point would the House, or would you recommend the House, consider articles of impeachment for that?
I think first you have to communicate. Look, I don't think these guys set out to cause a constitutional crisis. I think they set out to pay off their allies in the gay community and to do something that they thought was clever. I think that they didn't understand the implication that having a president personally suspend a law is clearly unconstitutional. I mean, this is an impossible
So what's the
precedent.
remedy? What's the remedy
The first remedy is for the Congress to confront him, and for the Congress to say the president has to enforce his own oath, and for the country to get educated about this idea that if you go back and you watch him putting his hand on the Bible, swearing that he will in fact enforce defend the Constitution and enforce the laws.
Okay. You also have Obama continuing to implement Obamacare, which has been ruled unconstitutional, the entire law. What about that?
Well, I'm strongly with Congressman Steve King. I think they should have a vote on cutting off all funding. The House has already passed repeal of Obamacare. I think with the judge who has ruled that the entire bill is unconstitutional, there are solid grounds for the House to cut off all funding for implementation. Again, I think they also should simply eliminate all the extra bureaucracy that the Obama administration has asked for, whether it's the additional 1,200 IRS agents or it's a tripling of the public relations budget at Health and Human Services so that we use our own tax money to brainwash us into doing what Obama wants. I think the House should be very aggressive in defunding Obamacare until we get to a point where we can repeal all of it.
Is implementing an unconstitutional law possibly impeachable?
Well, I think not if the Congress pays for it. I mean, that's why cutting off the funding changes the whole equation. Once you cut off the funding, it would be illegal to implement that. This goes back to what happened with Reagan on the Contras in Nicaragua. I mean, when the Congress cuts off the funding, which is a legitimate part of our constitutional process, whether it's liberals doing it or conservatives doing it, the president has an obligation to respect the Congress's right to decide whether or not to spend money, and that's central to the balance of power the Founding Fathers created.
So if he continues to implement the law after funding is cut off, then
you'd have a real crisis, because then, frankly, but remember, he would then be asking all of his appointees to break the law, to commit a felony. I mean, to spend money that the Congress hasn't appropriated, means they're personally liable to pay it back. Now, I don't think Secretary Sebelius is going to start spending money that she could be liable for personally repaying. So I think these kind of fights best occur one step at a time. You don't leap ahead to the end of the game. You try to figure out what's the logical next step. On Obamacare, the logical next step is cut off all the money, refuse to hire the new bureaucrats, and then watch it basically collapse of its own weight.
Some Republicans are for completely severing all funding, but others say no, there's something in the rules that doesn't allow that. What are they talking about?
I think you're talking about a procedural problem. There are certain bills, like the continuing resolution, which, if they're written narrowly, only affect this amount of time and space. You couldn't, to attach something like that to a continuing resolution has a different complexity than to pass it as a freestanding thing or to pass it on appropriations bills. And I think that's a procedural argument. It's not an argument about whether or not you can do it, it's how do you do it.